Okay, so the next couple of chapters of Numbers, 5 and 6, are very different from anything we've already read, or very different from anything that's going to come up right after that, starting in Numbers 7. These are going to be another section of the Lord saying. The Lord said to Moses, 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 the Lord said to Moses. So another series of sayings from the Lord to Moses. I don't know if these are supposed to be taking place in the same day as these censuses were taking place, or if this is just random information that was given to Moses and for some reason was included here. I don't know. I mean, when you get to these Lord saying to Moses's or Lord saying to anybody's, and especially when you get to a bunch of them in a row, I mean, it gets really difficult to determine when these sayings are being communicated. I think, and when you get here, you've got to kind of operate on the assumption that they're not laid out in chronological sequencing, unless you see clear evidence that they are. Generally speaking, it's safe to assume that they're not, unless there's a specific reason for them to be. And generally, and instead of chronologically sequenced, they're being arranged for some other, by some other standard. So we're going to have a couple of chapters full of these Lord saying to Moses sections, and then we're going to have another series of events which actually take place before the ones we just got done reading. The Lord said to Moses, "Command the Israelites to send away from the camp anyone who has an infectious skin disease or a discharge of any kind." That would be a sexual discharge or a discharge relating to the genitalia, either male or female. "Or who is ceremonially unclean because of a dead body. Send away male and female alike. Send them outside the camp so they will not defile their camp where I dwell among them." The Israelites did this. They sent them outside the camp. They did this just as the Lord had instructed Moses. We read about that in Leviticus. We've already read the instructions governing these different conditions and the various purification rituals they went through to be made clean again and be welcomed back into the camp. You are not going to get through life never being unclean. Okay? Being unclean, being in an unclean state, doesn't inherently mean that you're in a sinful state. Because you can become unclean through means that are not at all sinful. I mean, simply burying your father makes you unclean. So there's nothing wrong with burying your father. There's nothing wrong with putting a loved one to rest. Burying your dead. Now, the priests weren't supposed to touch these people or certain kinds of people or whatever. But someone had to bury the dead. I mean, someone had to do it. You weren't going to get through life without having sex. These discharges that come out of your genitalia were going to happen sooner or later to somebody. And it happens to male and female alike. So you weren't going to get through life never entering an unclean state. Being in an unclean state does not automatically mean that you're in a sinful state, or that you're separated from God, or that you're being banished from the community. I think it is symbolic. I think one of the symbolic messages that is being portrayed with this is that we can't get through life without committing a sin. Just like these people couldn't get through life without ever entering an unclean state. It was going to happen to them, and it was going to happen to them over and over and over again. We can't get through life without being in a sinful state. Now, the unclean state and the sinful state are not the same thing, but I do believe there is a symbolic message being communicated there. The Lord said to Moses, "Say to the Israelites, when a man or woman wrongs another in any way, and so is unfaithful to the Lord." So when you've wronged someone, when you have committed an offense against someone, you've really committed an offense against the Lord. The Lord is the ultimate victim of every sin ever committed. Whether it's whoever your human victim is, assuming you even have one, the Lord is the ultimate victim of every sin ever committed. So is unfaithful to the Lord. That person is guilty and must confess the sin he has committed, or she, because this includes women too. He must make full restitution for his wrong, add 1/5 to it, and give it all to the person he has wronged. But if that person has no close relative to whom restitution can be made for the wrong, assuming the person has died and has no family members left, the restitution belongs to the Lord and must be given to the priest, along with the ram with which atonement is made for him. All the sacred contributions the Israelites bring to a priest will belong to him. Each man's sacred gifts are his own, but what he gives to the priest will belong to the priest. Okay, this next section is one of the most head-scratching sections we're going to find for a while. We've had some head scratchers before, but this is going to be up there. To our culture today, this seems like one of the most ridiculous things you'll ever come across. But let's bear with it and read it and see if we can figure out what this means. This is a test of an unfaithful woman. There is no corresponding test of an unfaithful man. This is a test of an unfaithful woman. This is definitely a one-sided test, and it is definitely reflective of a culture where men had all the power in the culture. But let's go ahead and read this. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Speak to the Israelites and say to them, if a man's wife goes astray and is unfaithful to him by sleeping with another man, and this is hidden from her husband, and her impurity is undetected, since there is no witness against her, and she has not been caught in the act." They didn't perform detective work back then. They didn't examine. They didn't have kits that they could use to examine whether somebody has had sex with somebody else or anything along those lines. They couldn't even take fingerprints. Okay, we read earlier about some of the commands of unlawful sinning or unaware sinning or sitting when nobody thinks you're, it's like they didn't necessarily conduct detective work back then to find out what really happened. And if feelings of jealousy come over her husband, nowadays we'd hire a private eye to follow them around and take pictures. They didn't do that back then. If feelings of jealousy come over her husband, and he suspects his wife, and she is impure, or if he is jealous and suspects her, even though she is not impure, then he is to take his wife to the priest. Now, right there, we have a difference between the Israelite culture and the cultures around them. Because in the Israelite culture, if the husband suspects his wife of unfaithfulness, he has to take his wife to the priest. In a lot of the cultures around them, he didn't have to do that. If he suspected his wife of unfaithfulness, he could do whatever he wanted to do with her. We already saw a little bit of that earlier. Remember when Tamar tricked Judah into sleeping with her, and she got pregnant by it, and it was found that she was pregnant, and they didn't know who the father was, and so Judah wanted her burned. Now she wasn't even his wife; she was the wife of his dead son, but he still had authority over her and wanted her burned until she cleverly revealed that he was the one that actually fathered these children. So he had authority to do that because his honor was at stake. Like he was wronged by this. I mean, they would have done it. I mean, they were bringing her out to do it. The only reason why they stopped is because she showed them the evidence of who the father was, because she had anticipated that. So Judah at that time had the authority to do with Tamar pretty much whatever he wanted to. And the cultures around Israel at the time of a husband who suspects his wife, or even in this case his daughter-in-law, not even his wife, of being unfaithful, had the right to do pretty much whatever he wanted to do to her. So right away we're putting a limiting factor on that by saying that this suspicious husband cannot just take out whatever retribution on his wife that he feels like he has to bring her to the priest. So that right away kind of puts a barrier in there, a barrier in place to protect this woman, innocent or guilty, from her husband's retribution, which corresponding cultures around them didn't do. He, this jealous husband, must also take an offering of 1/10 of an ephah of barley flour on her behalf. He must not pour oil on it or put incense on it, because those are holy type things, because it is a grain offering for jealousy, a reminder offering to draw attention to guilt. The priest shall bring her, the suspected woman, and there is of course no corresponding test for potentially unfaithful husbands. This is strictly a one-sided affair. The priest shall I'm not even sure if the Old Testament is aware of the concept of unfaithful husbands, frankly. I'm not sure if the people of that day even understood what an unfaithfulness in the Bible is almost all, especially in the Old Testament, is pretty much always assumed to be on the part of the wife. I'm not even sure if they were aware of the concept of an unfaithful husband. I'm not sure if that idea ever even occurred to them. The priest shall bring her and have her stand before the Lord. Then he shall take some holy water in a clay jar and put some dust from the tabernacle floor into the water. This is very reminiscent of when Moses ground up. Remember how back in Exodus, when Moses was up on Mount Sinai getting the instructions for how to build the tabernacle and all that, and while he was gone for a period of days, 40 days, the people down below prostituted themselves with this golden calf. They were unfaithful. They were acting as an unfaithful wife. Israel, one of the reasons why the emphasis on unfaithfulness is always on the wife in the Old Testament is because Israel is compared to the wife of God. And God is not going to be unfaithful. So if there is unfaithfulness in the covenant relationship or in the marriage partnership, it's always going to be on Israel's side, and Israel is the wife in the relationship. So that's one of the reasons why the Old Testament always depicts unfaithfulness as a problem with the wife and never the husband. But in this case, Israel prostituted themselves with this golden calf they made Aaron make. They had Aaron make. And as punishment, one of the things Moses did as punishment was he ground up this calf and scattered its ashes into the water and made them drink the water. So this is reminiscent of that. They're making this woman drink water that's got dust in it. This is also something of a trial by ordeal. If you've ever heard of a trial by ordeal, it's the idea that you're making the person prove innocence by doing something. We've heard of the Salem witch trials or something like that, where you would throw someone tied up in a body of water, and if they were innocent, the angels would save them and they would float. If they drowned, then they were guilty. Like that. This is a concept of that. Now, in this case, well, we'll read as we go on. This actually kind of inverts. This is, man-made trials by ordeal, of course, will punish a person by default and only save them when the miraculous happens. In this case, that gets flipped. After the priest has had the woman stand before the Lord, he shall loosen her hair. So he's going to let all her hair down. Well, in their culture, a woman letting her hair down was shameful. We read in 1 Corinthians that a hair covering was given to a woman. Hair was given to a woman as a covering. So this woman is standing basically bare before the Lord with her hair down. And place in her hands the reminder offering, the grain offering for jealousy, while he himself holds the bitter water that brings a curse. So she is now holding the offerings that her husband brought, and the priest is holding this jar full of water with dust in it. Then the priest shall put the woman under oath and say to her, if no other man has slept with you, and you have not gone astray and become impure while married to your husband, may this bitter water that brings a curse not harm you. But if you have gone astray while married to your husband, and you have defiled yourself by sleeping with a man other than your husband, here the priest is to put the woman under this curse of the oath. May the Lord cause your people to curse and denounce you, when he causes your thigh to waste away and your abdomen to swell. Or, in footnote, causes you to have a miscarrying womb and barrenness. So there may be an element of whose child is it in back of all this. May this water that brings a curse into your body, so that your abdomen swells and your thigh wastes away, or so that it causes you to be barren and having a miscarrying womb. Then the woman is to say, Amen, so be it. The priest is to write these curses on a scroll and then wash them off into the bitter water. He shall have the woman drink the bitter water that brings a curse, and this water will enter her and cause her bitter suffering. The priest is to take from her hands the grain offering for jealousy, wave it before the Lord, and bring it to the altar. The priest is then to take a handful of the grain offering as a memorial offering, and burn it on the altar, After that, he is to have the woman drink the water. I already had her drink the water, but I guess we're doing it again. Apparently, she only drank half of it the first time. I don't know. If she has defiled herself and been unfaithful to her husband, then when she is made to drink the water that brings a curse, it will go into her and cause her bitter suffering. Her abdomen will swell and her thigh will waste away, for she will have barrenness and a miscarrying womb, and she will become accursed among her people. Note, however, that she doesn't die. If, however, the woman has not defiled herself and is free from impurity, she will be cleared of guilt and will be able to have children. This, then, is the law of jealousy, when a woman goes astray and defiles herself while married to her husband, or when feelings of jealousy come over a man because he suspects his wife. The priest is to have her stand before the Lord and is to apply this entire law to her. The husband will be innocent of any wrongdoing, but the woman will bear the consequences of her sin. So this is a very strange little story here, a very strange little test of purity. Very odd to our ears, very against what we would consider to be our cultural standards. It is, however, meant to be a defense and a protection for this woman, because again, in most of the cultures around them, and in fact even in their own culture in previous years, a man who suspects his wife of having an affair or having been unfaithful to him would have the right to do to her pretty much whatever he wanted to. We saw earlier an example of this where Judah wanted to burn Tamar to death at news that she was pregnant. And she wasn't even his wife. She wasn't even married to him. And they were going to do it. They were bringing her out to do it. So the only reason why they didn't is because she had anticipated that would happen and had collected the evidence and saved it of proving who the father was, and it was Judah himself. So to save face, then he couldn't go through with it because that would make him look. It was a sin against him. You know, it was a sin against him. A woman being unfaithful to her husband is a sin against her husband. And like I said, throughout the Old Testament, the woman will always be assumed to be the unfaithful member of the party, the unfaithful party in the relationship. It's I at the top of my head, I can't think of a single example where the man is ever assumed to be unfaithful or ever even portrayed as being unfaithful. Like I'm not even sure if the Old Testament understands the concept of an unfaithful husband. Unfaithful husbands are pretty much just polygamists, and that was totally okay. So like David has a bunch of wives. Solomon has even more. You know, it's like that's. I'm not sure if that is ever condemned as a problem in the Old Testament. Maybe it should have been, but I don't think it ever actually was. I mean, David's polygamous ways will not help him. You know, his household is going to suffer because of it, and Solomon is going to have even more trouble because of it. So it's like it's even back in the days of Abraham, having multiple wives never leads to a stable household. Certainly didn't in Jacob's day. I mean, it never does. Like there's really no example of it ever actually doing that. But I don't know if the Old Testament really even understands the idea of a husband being unfaithful. A husband being unfaithful is just a husband having multiple wives. Like that's all that is. So that's a difference. That's just a difference. Like that's just a different cultural standard. The other issue also is that because the woman would always know whose kid it is. Okay. If the husband doesn't, if the husband suspects, in back of this is the idea the woman is pregnant and the husband is not sure it's his kid. It doesn't actually say that. Like that point, again, that's something that the text itself does not actually explicitly make that connection. But I believe that's in back of it. What's going on here in the back of the text is that the husband is not sure the kid is going to be his. It's not his kid. And the other reason why, you know, I've already mentioned two reasons. One reason why the woman is always assumed to be the unfaithful one is because it's a patriarchal culture, and that's just how things are. I mean, that's just how that culture was. Two is because in the Old Testament in particular, the covenant relationship between God and Israel is pictured as the marriage between a husband and a wife. In fact, that's actually what the whole union of male and female and husband and wife is about from the very beginning. When God created the male and female, instituted the institution of marriage, the whole point of it is to demonstrate the relationship he wants to have with his people. And in that case, God is in the role of the husband, and the people are in the role of the wife. And if either of these parties is going to be unfaithful, it's always going to be the people. It's not going to be God. So the other, in addition to just the overall, highly patriarchal culture of that time, another specific reason why the Old Testament is this way is because Israel is pictured as the unfaithful wife, or the unfaithful wife is used as a picture of Israel, however you want to look at it. And again, if either member of the covenant party is going to be unfaithful, it's going to be the one that's not God. And so that's another reason. And the prophets, of course, will make a big point out of that. Hosea, the entire book of the prophet Hosea, is that he was told to marry a woman who was going to be unfaithful to him, and it was supposed to be a purposeful object lesson in this regards about Hosea and Gomer, and compare it to God and Israel. And so that's another reason why the Old Testament in particular is this way. And then another reason, a third reason, is that if the woman is unfaithful, the husband doesn't know if the kids are his. And that creates a disruption in the family dynamic, which in turn spills out from there to the rest of society. The woman always knows whose kid it's going to be, or if it's her kid, certainly. And so the husband may not necessarily know that. So in back of this, I believe you have the idea that the woman has gotten pregnant and the husband is not certain if it's his kid. The other thing also is that we don't ever actually see this. There's no recorded instance in the rest of the Old Testament of this ever being done. I mean, it may have been. I'm sure it was, in fact. It's like the year of Jubilee. I don't believe there's any record in the Old Testament of the year of Jubilee ever being observed. That doesn't mean it wasn't. It just means that we have no record of it. Maybe they have no record of it because it was such a commonplace event that they just didn't feel the need to record it because it happens all the time. Why record it? It's nothing out of the ordinary. Concerning what the year of Jubilee was and what it meant for the economy of Israel, and how people are, and knowing what I know about human nature, being a human being and all, I'm going to assume that they probably didn't follow the year of Jubilee the way they were supposed to. But I don't know. I can't prove that either way. I don't know if this test was ever actually performed. It probably was, but I don't know that for certain. My guess is that this was probably done. This test is put in here, like I said earlier, partially as a restraining factor against jealous husbands from taking retribution on their wives unnecessarily, which we've already seen an example of something like this happening before, and which we know from other case laws and other cultures around the world at the time. Typically, the jealous husband had the right to do whatever he wanted to do to his wife. I mean, jealous husbands to this day kill their wives for reasons like this. This strikes at the core of masculinity. It's like we cannot handle it when we think that our honor has been besmirched by our wives. It drives us nuts even to this day. And so this law is somewhat put in here as a limiting factor against the husband's wrath. It doesn't say whether or not the husband is legitimate in his suspicions. My overall impression is that he probably isn't. This test seems to be more designed to prove the woman's innocence rather than her guilt. I talked earlier about the idea of trial by ordeal. What this does differently than our own trial ordeals that we as human beings come up with is that this one requires a miraculous intervention to prove the woman's guilt rather than her innocence. Man-made trials of ordeal require miraculous intervention to prove the suspect's innocence. It assumes the suspect's guilt. When we throw a woman into a river and assume that if she drowns, it's because she's guilty, and if she floats, it's because an angel has saved her since she's innocent. And then, when, of course, she inevitably drowns, we're not surprised because we assumed she was guilty from the first place. The test was designed to establish her guilt. This test is designed actually to establish a woman's innocence and requires miraculous intervention to prove her guilt. Drinking this water full of dust in and of itself wouldn't have been fatal. It may have been unpleasant, but it would not have been fatal. In fact, the penalty itself isn't even death. Remember, Adultery was punishable by stoning, and he stoned both members of the adulterating party. It seems like it was limited only to when they were caught. Again, they didn't perform detective work back in those days. The jealous husband isn't given any provision of how to, like, investigate the case and find out whether or not his wife really is unfaithful. So it seems like when they do stone adulterers and adulteresses, first of all, they are supposed to stone them together, and apparently they stone them when they catch them in the act. In John 8, we have the story of the woman caught in adultery. They say they caught her in the act. They don't mention the man. He's not even a part of it. He may have been part of a setup. I don't know. I mean, no one knows. They may have already stoned him. Who knows? He may have run away. They may have let him go. In fact, he may have been in on it. It may have been a setup just to trap Jesus with this moral quandary they wanted to pose him with. The text doesn't say. We don't know. But the penalty for adultery was stoning, and it was stoning for both parties both members of the party, assuming apparently they were caught in the act. In this case, they're not caught in the act. There's no indication of who the man is almost supposed to be unfaithful with. We're not even trying to find out who that may have been. My guess is that in the majority of instances, if this ritual was conducted, I'm assuming it probably was, my guess is that in the majority of instances, the woman was probably innocent and the husband really was just jealous. And so drinking the dirty water, even though it wouldn't have tasted good, would have established her innocence because she wouldn't have gotten sick afterwards. Because for her to suffer the consequences, which seemed to do with miscarrying, which seemed to do with some problem with her uterus, doesn't say that specifically, but it seems like that's the idea here. It's going to punish her by miscarrying or causing her to become barren or somehow. But for that to happen, it would require a miraculous intervention on God's part to establish her guilt. Whereas man-made trials by ordeal require miraculous intervention to save the person. By default, the tests are designed to kill the person, assuming the guilt. So that's just a difference. So it is a very strange chapter. But I actually kind of like this chapter because it is so different from what we would expect. And it is one of those chapters where it's easy for us in our culture today, at first glance, to tear this chapter down and talk about how awful it is. But when you actually start to think about it, it's very much, it makes the exact opposite the point that we want it to make today. Okay, let me say it this way. Today, in our very female-driven culture, we have one of the big, strong, motivating, animating factors today, driving people away from the Bible, is how mean it is to women. That's just, if you were to list like the top 5 number of factors today that are, pushing this spirit of hostility towards the Bible and towards the teachings in it, or learning, or studying it, that'd be one of them. It probably wouldn't be number 1, but it would be up there. It'd be up there pretty high. For some people, it might be number 1. For some individual groups or people, it may be number 1. Overall, I'm saying it's probably in the top 5. And chapters like this are often used as like proof texts to show how mean the Bible is to women. Now, at first glance, it may seem that way. But I actually like this chapter because when you actually get down and look at it, this chapter does exactly the opposite what people like that would tell you it does. This chapter is actually written very much in defense of the woman being questioned, rather than... it is true that there is no corresponding test of an unfaithful husband. And again, like I said, I'm not even sure if the Old Testament understands the concept of an unfaithful husband. I'm not even sure if ancient Israel even that such a thing even existed in their minds. But that is, I think, indicative of a very different culture today that no longer exists. And that's fine. And maybe that culture today shouldn't exist anymore. But this particular chapter doesn't make that point. Okay, that's enough of that for today. We've gotten into Numbers. Numbers is a very odd book. It's a very strange, it's a very disparate book. Like, it has a lot of different kinds of material in it. And it goes from these, like I said, these more elaboration on the laws, or more laws, or more information on the laws, to some narrative sections, to some just flat out genealogical or number sections. And it is kind of a strange book in that regards. I would say probably of the works of Moses, Numbers might be like the least familiar. Leviticus, as I said before, is the one that's probably the most deliberately overlooked. But we at least know what Leviticus is. It's the law. It's the sacrifices, okay? It's a boring book with a bunch of lawyerly stuff in it. Like, we may not really, we may overlook it. We may overlook it intentionally. But at least we know what's in it. Like, Numbers is a book that you'd be surprised, I think, how little aware we are of what's in it. I think generally we know it is a book that tells the story of them getting to the promised land. There's a lot more in it than that I think we often forget about or overlook. So, and I forget about, like, every time I read Numbers, I find myself kind of remembering, oh yeah, that's in here. Like that just even when even I do that. Like, so like I said, I read the Bible every time I finish it. I just start it up again. And I've done this I don't know how many times now. And every time I go through Numbers, like, oh yeah, that's where that is. It's like I remember reading that somewhere. It's in Numbers. Okay, that's right. I remember that now.